The cold boy's air bit at the glass of my taxi, a thin sheet of frost clinging to the edges despite the heater blasting on high. It was 6:15 a.m., and the sky was the color of a deep bruise. Not quack, but not yet morning. My first fare of the day was a woman named Beatrice, whose perfume smelled aggressively of money and judgment. "Can you turn this heat down? It's absolutely stifling in here," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the worn upholstery. She was bundled in a cashmere coat that probably cost more than my last 3 rent payments combined. "Of course," I mumbled, turning the dial down. A shiver immediately traced its way up my spine, but I ignored it. Rule number 1 of taxi driving: the customer's comfort is paramount, even when the customer is a walking, talking embodiment of everything that's wrong with your morning. "And this music," she sighed, gesturing toward the radio where a soft rock station was playing something harmless from the 80s. "Is there anything else? It's sot pedestrian." I switched it to a classical station. The violins felt just as tense as I did. For the next 20 minutes, Beatrice found fault with everything. My driving was too slow, then too fast. The route I took, the one GPS specifically recommended to avoid construction on Franklin Road, was obviously the long way around. The squeak from my left rear tire was giving her a migraine. I just gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white, and focused on the streetlights gliding past. I was a ghost in the driver's seat, a non-entity whose only purpose was to absorb her complaints and get her to her destination. A pristine, oversized house in the North End that looked like it was plucked from a magazine. When we finally pulled up to her curb, the meter read $18.50. She handed me a crisp $20 bill. "Keep the change," she said, not with generosity, but with a dismissive flick of her wrist, as if the $1.50 was an insult she was paying to be rid of me. As she stepped out, she delivered her parting shot. You should really invest in some air fresheners. It smells a bit like desperation in here." The door slammed shut, and I just sat there, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. Desperation. She wasn't wrong. It was the faint, lingering scent of stale coffee, the financial section of the newspaper I used as a floor mat, and the low-grade panic that had become my constant companion. I watched her walk up the heated cobblestone path to her perfect house, and I felt a familiar, hollow ache in my chest. I wasn't just a driver. I was an emotional punching bag, a temporary receptacle for the frustrations of people whose biggest problem was the temperature in a stranger's car. The feeling of being invisible was something I was getting used to, but it always stung. It reminded me of another kind of invisibility, a more comfortable but soul-crushing kind. My gaze drifted past the meter, and suddenly I wasn't in my beat-up Ford Crown Victoria anymore. I was back in a beige cubicle, surrounded by the gentle hum of computers and the smell of burnt popcorn from the break room. I used to be an insurance claims processor. The job was the definition of beige. Beige walls, beige computer, beige phone. My life was a symphony of clicks and keystrokes, of listening to people on the end of the line, either furious or heartbroken over a dented bumper or a flooded basement. I was good at it. I was patient, empathetic, and meticulously organized. I had a steady paycheck, health insurance, a 4,001k. On paper, it was a good, responsible job for a single mother of 2. But paper doesn't pay the bills. Not all of them, anyway. I remember one specific Tuesday, I was sitting in my cubicle, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on everything. I had a photo of my kids, Ellie and Lily, taped to the monitor. Ellie was 8 at the time, with a serious expression and deep, thoughtful eyes that saw everything. Lily was 6, all wild blonde curls and a smile that could melt glaciers. In the photo, they were hugging, squeezing each other so tight you couldn't see where one began and the other ended. My phone buzzed. It was a text from the school nurse. "Hi, this is Nurse Miller. Ellie has a fever and needs to be picked up." My heart sank. I glanced at the clock, 2:30 p.m. My boss, a man named Mr. Henderson who valued punctuality above all else, was in a meeting. I typed out a quick email, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Family emergency. Need to leave early. We'll make up the hours. I didn't wait for a reply. I grabbed my purse, threw on my coat, and practically ran out of the building, the guilt of leaving growing at me. That night, after getting Ely settled with some medicine and a cool cloth on his forehead, I sat down at my small kitchen table. The table was cluttered with the artifacts of our life, a half-finished drawing from Laylee, a permission slip for a school field trip, and a stack of envelopes, bills. The electric bill was past due. The rent check was going to be dangerously close to bouncing. Ellie needed new sneakers because he'd worn a hole clean through the sole of his old ones, and Lily was growing so fast her jeans were all turning into capris. I opened my banking app and stared at the number. It was so small, so laughably inadequate. My steady paycheck from the insurance company evaporated the second it hit my account. It was a constant, terrifying magic trick. And there were no benefits, no 401k. That could fix the immediate, crushing reality that I couldn't afford new shoes for my son. That was the night desperation finally won. The kids were asleep, their soft breaths filling the small apartment. The only light was the cold, blue glow from my laptop screen. I typed the words into the search bar, the ones you type when you've run out of respectable options. How to make money fast in Boise. The results were a predictable mix of scams and sadness, online surveys that paid pennies, multi-level marketing schemes promising a life of luxury selling leggings or essential oils, donating plasma. And then I saw a tug, drive for Boise independent taxi, be your own boss, set your own hours, be my own boss, set my own hours. It sounded like freedom. It sounded like a way to be there, to pick up my sick kid without feeling a wave of professional guilt. It sounded like a way to work a 16-hour day if I had to, just to make sure that rent check would clear. The next morning, I called in sick to the insurance company and went to the taxi depot to fill out an application. 2 weeks later, I gave Mr. Henderson my notice. My mother thought I had lost my mind. Taxi driver? She'd said over our Sunday dinner, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. "Sarah, you have a college degree. You had a respectable job with benefits. You're going to throw that all away to drive strangers around. It's not safe. It sits beneath you." I looked across the table at Ely and Lily, who were happily munching on their pot roast, oblivious to the tension. I loved my mother, but she came from a different world, a world where you got one good job and held onto it for dear life. She didn't understand the gaping chasm between respectable and livable. "Mom, it pays the bills?" I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "That's all that matters. I need to be able to afford shoes for Ellie. I need to be there for them. This lets me do that." She just shook her head, a look of profound disappointment on her face. That look hurt more than any of Beatrice's insults. But I held my ground. I was doing this for them. I would swallow my pride, deal with the condescending passengers and the long, lonely hours, and I would make it work. I had to. And so my life became a series of sunrises and sunsets viewed through a windshield. I learned the city's arteries by heart, the secret shortcuts, the best places to get a cheap hot cup of coffee at 4 a.m. I ferried business people to the airport, college kids to late night parties, and elderly folks to their doctor's appointments. Most rides were unremarkable, a blur of faces and destinations. But some pics, some stuck with you. A few months into the job, on a blazing hot August afternoon, I got a call to a budget grocery store on the outskirts of town. The kind of place where you bag your own groceries, and the brands are all ones you've never heard of. It was my go-to spot. I was waiting by the curb when an elderly woman with flyaway white hair and a deeply wrinkled, kind face emerged, struggling with two overflowing paper bags. She looked frail, like a strong gust of wind might carry her away. I jumped out of the car. "Here, let me help you with those," I said, taking the bags from her. They were heavier than they looked. "Oh, thank you, dear," she breathed, a gentle smile gracing her lips. "My name's Lucille." I helped her into the back seat and loaded the groceries into the trunk. As I drove her to the small, tidy bungalow she called home, she chatted away. She told me about her garden, her late husband, and the outrageous price of canned peaches. There was a warmth to her, a genuine sweetness that was a welcome antidote to the usual cynicism I encountered. When we arrived, the fare was $9.25. She opened a worn, leather coin purse and started counting out quarters and dimes. I saw her hands tremble slightly. She got to $8 and then paused, her face falling. "Oh, dear," she whispered, her voice thick with embarrassment. "I seem to be a bit short. I must have miscalculated." I looked at her, at this sweet old woman who was probably living on a fixed income, and my heart just broke. I thought of the 20 Beatrice had thrown at me. I thought of my own precarious budget. And then I made a decision. "You know what, Lucille?" I said, turning around in my seat and giving her the warmest smile I could muster. "Today, all rides for lovely ladies with excellent taste in canned peaches are on the house. No charge." Tears welled in her eyes. "Oh, I couldn't possibly. I insist," I said firmly. "Please, let me get your groceries inside." She finally relented, and as I placed the bags on her kitchen counter, she took my hand. Her skin was as soft and thin as tissue paper. She looked me straight in the eye, and her gaze was so intense, so full of a strange, ancient wisdom, it felt like she was looking directly into my soul. "You have a good heart, child," she said, her voice low and steady. "The world has been heavy on your shoulders. I can see it. But you are stronger than you think. Everything is going to be all right. You'll see." I didn't know what to say. I just mumbled a thank you, feeling a strange lump in my throat. As I drove away, her words echoed in my head. "Everything is going to be all right." It was a simple phrase, the kind of thing people say all the time. But coming from her, it felt less like a platitude and more like a prophecy. It was the first time in a very long time that I had allowed myself to even consider the possibility that it might be true. Her words were a small comfort, a flickering candle in the darkness of my past. My shoulders were heavy, heavier than she could know. The weight wasn't just from bills and work. It was the wreckage of a life I had tried so hard to build. It was the ghost of my first marriage. His name was Jason. I met him when I was 22, and he was charming, funny, and full of life. He had a son from a previous relationship, a beautiful, solemn little boy named Ely. Ely's mother had taken off when he was just a baby, and Jason was raising him alone. I fell in love with both of them. I didn't see Ely as a stepson from the moment I met him. He was simply my son. I adopted him legally a year after Jason, and I were married. 2 years later, we had Lily. For a little while, we were a perfect, happy family. But Jason had a sickness, one that he hid from me at first. He was a brilliant weekend drinker, the life of the party. I didn't see the problem until the drinking started bleeding into the weekdays. It started with a beer or two after work, then a bottle of wine with dinner every night. Soon, I was finding empty vodka bottles hidden in the garage. In the back of his closet, under the seat of his car, the charming, funny man I married began to disappear, replaced by a sullen, angry stranger. He lost his job. Then another one. The fights became epic, terrifying thunderstorms of rage and recrimination that left me shaking and the kids hiding in their rooms. I begged him to get help. He'd promised to stop, and for a few days, a week, the sun would come out. The old Jason would reappear, and I'd let myself hope. But the storm always came back, worse than before. The final straw came on Lily's 4th birthday. He'd promised to be there, promised to be sober. He showed up 3 hours late, stumbling, drunk, slurring his words as he tried to help her with her presence. He knocked over her cake, and when I tried to get him to leave, he shoved me. Not hard, but it was enough. I saw the look in Eli's eyes, not fear, but a cold, hard resignation. He had seen this too many times. In that moment, I knew I had to get them out. I filed for divorce the next day. He never fought it. He just faded away. A few years later, I heard he died of liver failure in another state. All he left behind was a mountain of debt and 2 beautiful children who barely remembered his smile. I spent the next few years just trying to keep my head above water, working the insurance job and then driving the taxi, powered by caffeine and a fierce, primal love for my kids. I told myself I was done with men, done with the chaos and the heartbreak. And then, just when I had built my walls up nice and high, I found a new job, a stable one, at a grocery store, the same one where I had met Lucille. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. I started as a cashier and worked my way up to shift supervisor. For the first time in years, I had a predictable schedule. I could be home for dinner every night. I could help the kids with their homework. The constant grinding panic in my chest began to subside. It was during that time I discovered a discrepancy. The store manager, a woman named Melissa, was a frazzled, overworked single mom like me. I liked her. But I started noticing the cash deposits for the day were consistently short. Not by much, just $20 or $30 here and there. It was subtle enough to be written off as cashier error, but it was happening on her shifts. My heart sank. I knew what it was like to be desperate. I didn't want to get her in trouble, but it was also theft. And my name was on those deposit slips too. I spent a week tracking the numbers, my stomach in knots. The evidence was undeniable. I finally confronted her in the back office one evening. I laid the deposit slips out on the desk. "Melissa," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "The numbers aren't adding up. Can you explain this?" Her face went pale. First, she tried to deny it, blaming the cashiers, the system. But I held my ground, pointing to the pattern. Finally, she broke down, sobbing. Her car had broken down. Her son needed braces. She was behind on her mortgage. It was the same sad story I knew so well. "I was going to pay it back," she cried. I swear, I looked at her, and I didn't feel anger. I just felt a profound sadness. "You have to pay it back now, Melissa," I said gently. "All of it. We'll tell corporate it was a clerical error that we've now rectified. You do that, and this conversation never happened." She did. And I was promoted to interim store manager a month later when she moved to a different city. The experience changed me. It showed me I was capable, that I had a backbone I didn't know existed. I felt a flicker of confidence I hadn't felt in years. On a whim, I went to a salon and had them chop off my long, tired hair into a short, stylish bob. I took $20 I couldn't really spare and a bought-it red dress from a thrift store. The first time I wore it to work, I felt like a different person. I stood up straighter. I smiled more. And that's when I met Peter Hall. He was a regular customer, a handsome, silver-haired man who worked in construction. He always came through my checkout line, even if others were shorter. He had a kind smile and a gentle laugh. He told me my new haircut looked sensational. He started bringing me coffee in the mornings. He was patient and kind, and he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. He was the complete opposite of Jason. He was sober. We fell in love slowly, then all at once. He was wonderful with Ely and Lily. He'd take Ellie fishing and teach Lily how to ride her bike without training wheels. He'd come home from work, and his first question was always, "How was your day?" He listened. For the first time in a decade, I felt safe. I felt loved. We got married on a beautiful autumn day in a small ceremony at the courthouse. I truly believed my life had finally turned a corner. But addiction is a cunning, baffling monster. For 2 years, everything was perfect. And then I found a bottle. Just one, an empty pin of whiskey tucked away in his toolbox. When I confronted him, he broke down, just like Melissa had. He said it was a one-time slip, that the stress of a big project had gotten to him. He was so remorseful, so convincing. I wanted to believe him, so I did. But it wasn't a one-time slip. It was the beginning of the end. The descent was faster this time, more brutal. The kind, gentle man I married began to vanish, replaced by a paranoid, angry ghost who looked at me with suspicion. He lost his job. The fight started again. The same script, a different actor. The night it all ended is seared into my memory. He had been drinking all day. I told him he needed to leave to sober up somewhere else before he could come home. The kids were at my mom's for the night, thank God. He left, but he came back around midnight, drunk and raging. He pounded on the front door, screaming my name, demanding to be let in. I was terrified. I called the police. By the time they arrived, he had collapsed on the front porch. They put him in the back of the patrol car to take him to the detox center. He was so intoxicated, he was barely conscious. I stood at the window, watching the taillights disappear down the street, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. An hour later, 2 different officers were at my door. Their faces were grim. Peter had a massive heart attack in the back of the patrol car. They had rushed him to the hospital, but it was too late. He was gone, just like that. I was a widow. A single mother all over again. The whiplash was staggering. I had gone from being blissfully happy to being completely alone in the space of a few months. The world felt cruel, arbitrary, and devoid of any meaning. I quit the grocery store job. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing his ghost in the aisles, of having to smile at the customers who all knew my story. So I went back to the only thing I knew, the only job that would let me disappear. I went back to the taxi, back to the anonymity of the driver's seat, to the endless loop of streets, to the comforting scent of desperation. Life settled into a new grim routine. Get up, get the kids to school, drive for 10 hours, pick up the kids, make dinner, help with homework, fall into bed, repeat. The grief was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of everything. But we were surviving. We were tough. And then the universe decided we weren't tough enough. It started with Ely. He came home from school one day complaining of a headache. I gave him some Tylenol and sent him to bed. The next morning, he woke up with a raging fever and was so weak he could barely stand. I rushed him to the emergency room. The next few weeks were a blur of hospitals, doctors, and terrifying, unpronounceable medical terms. They didn't know what was wrong with him. It wasn't the flu. It wasn't meningitis. It wasn't any of the usual suspects. He had some kind of mysterious, aggressive infection that was shutting down his body organ by organ. He was moved to the pediatric ICU. He was put on a ventilator. He was slipping away from me, and nobody could tell me why. I lived at that hospital. I slept in the uncomfortable vinyl chair next to his bed, my hand on his, willing him to fight. Lily went to stay with my mom. My days were measured in the beeps and wares of the machines that were keeping my son alive. I stopped driving the taxi. Our savings, what little there was, dwindled to nothing. The medical bills piled up, a mountain of paper that represented debt I could never hope to repay. Finally, the head of pediatric care, a kind but wary-looking man named Dr. Evans, sat me down in a small, sterile conference room. He looked at me with pity in his eyes, and I knew what was coming. "Sarah," he began, his voice soft. "We've done everything we can. The antibiotics aren't working. His systems are failing. I think it's time to prepare yourself. To say goodbye." The words didn't register at first. It was like he was speaking a foreign language. Say goodbye to my son, to my serious, thoughtful, beautiful boy. The floor seemed to drop out from beneath me. The world went silent, all except for a deafening roar in my own ears. I stumbled out of the room, back to Ely's bedside, and collapsed into the chair, the sobs tearing through me with a physical, violent force. This was it. This was the bottom. There was nowhere left to fall. I looked at my son, so small and still in the enormous bed, tubes and wires connecting him to a world he was rapidly leaving, and I felt a despair so profound it was like a physical weight crushing the very air from my lungs. I prayed. I begged to God I wasn't even sure I believed in anymore to just let me have my son back. But there was only the cold, sterile silence of the ICU, punctuated by the rhythmic sigh of the ventilator. I must have been there for hours, lost in a fog of grief. When I finally looked up, there was a figure standing in the doorway, an old woman with flyaway white hair and a kind, wrinkled face. It was Lucille. I hadn't seen her in years. I had no idea how she knew I was here, how she had found me. It didn't matter. She walked slowly to the bed, her eyes fixed on Ely. She placed her soft, papery hand on his forehead. "The poor, dear child," she whispered. Then she turned to me, and her eyes held the same ancient wisdom I remembered from her kitchen all those years ago. There was no pity in her gaze, only a calm, resolute strength. "Go to the cafeteria and get me a glass of water," she said. Her voice was gentle, but it held a command I didn't think to question. Numbly, I did as she asked. I returned with a plastic cup of lukewarm water. She took it from me and held it over Ely's chest. She closed her eyes and began to murmur, her lips moving in a silent, fervent prayer. She just stood there for what felt like an eternity, the cup held steady in her hands. Then she opened her eyes and showed me the cup. My breath caught in my throat. The water, which had been perfectly clear just moments before, was now murky and dark. Swirls of inky blackness moved through it, thick and viscous, like oil. "The sickness," she said simply. "It has to have a place to go." I stared at her, uncomprehending. "What did you do?" "The Lord works in ways we don't always understand, child," she said, her voice serene. "I will be back tomorrow. We will do this every day." She poured the black water down the sink in the room's small bathroom and left as quietly as she had come. I was left alone with the beeping machines and the impossible sight I had just witnessed. Was I hallucinating? Was I so broken by grief that my mind was playing tricks on me? But the next day, she returned. And the day after that, every single day for a week, she would come. She would stand over Eli, murmur her silent prayers, and hold the glass of water. And every day, the water would turn black. But I started to notice a change. On the fourth day, the blackness was less absolute, more of a dark gray. On the fifth day, it was the color of weak tea. On the sixth day, It was merely cloudy. On the seventh day, Lucille performed her ritual. She held the cup over Ellie, closed her eyes, and prayed. When she showed it to me, the water was as clear and pure as when it came from the tap. A single tear rolled down her wrinkled cheek. She smiled at me, a radiant, beautiful smile. "It is done," she whispered. "He will be well now." That afternoon, Eli's fever broke. The next morning, his blood pressure stabilized. By the end of the day, the doctors were cautiously optimistic. They took him off the ventilator, and he began to breathe on his own. They had no explanation. They ran tests. They looked at his charts, and they just shook their heads in disbelief. They called it a spontaneous remission, a 1 in a million recovery. They used a lot of scientific terms, but I knew what it was. It was a miracle. A week later, just 2 days before Christmas, I walked my son out of that hospital. He was weak, he was thin, but he was alive. He was home. As we decorated our small Christmas tree, the lights twinkling and reflecting in my children's joyful eyes, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in my entire life. Lucille's words from all those years ago came back to me. Everything is going to be all right. A few weeks later, my old boss from the grocery store called me. They had a permanent management position open and wanted to offer it to me. The old me would have jumped at the chance, grateful for any scrap of stability. But I wasn't the old me anymore. "I'll take it," I said, my voice clear and steady. But I want a 25% raise over what I was making before. He scoffed, told me it was impossible. I thanked him for the offer and told him to call me if he changed his mind. I wasn't going to sell myself short, not anymore. I had faced down death itself. I knew my own strength now. I knew my worth. 2 days later, he called back. He couldn't do 25%, but he could offer me a 20% raise, the highest the district manager would approve. I smiled. I accept. I still don't know who or what Lucille was. An angel saint or just a kind old woman with a faith so powerful it could bend reality. I tried to find her, to thank her, but she had moved away, leaving no forwarding address. It didn't matter. She had given me back my son. She had given me back my life. I don't drive the taxi anymore. But sometimes when I'm driving to my stable, well, paying job, I'll pass one of my old cars on the road. I'll see the driver's tired face in the rearview mirror, and I'll say a silent prayer for them. I know the scent of desperation she was talking about. But now, when I breathe deep, all I can smell is the clean, crisp air of a new morning and the sweet, intoxicating scent of hope. Everything was finally all right.